the Sublime may take you to some places you don't want to go, and beauty may seduce you or try to keep you in places that you shouldn't remain.
We always have this potential in us at every point in history, in every generation. There are always figures who, given the right push, given the right incentive, can grow into these great figures.
So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head.
Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the New Liar podcast. I'm your host, David Goslin, and I'm here with some new guests, some very interesting and enthusiastic guests that have been putting out a lot of content on their Substacks and outlets, making polemics, getting on their poetry soapboxes, and ostensibly talking about poetry, but then that leads us into all sorts of different spheres of discussion, doesn't it, guys? Welcome to the show.
Sure, yeah. Well, we were talking before you started recording about how, or you mentioned how poetry is intimately connected with culture as a whole and with our values as a whole. And I think that's really one of the most fundamental things that we agree on. I think you can't start talking about poetry without talking about the moral state of the world or of a particular culture. The values that it has and the sense of beauty that it has and what it is trying to uphold and what it is seeking. Poetry is always going to be a reflection of that. It's going to be, a sort of compartmentalized, concentrated, crystallized statement of thought that reflects a sense of value, where we should be focusing our attention, what we should be glorifying. And, that in turn helps to encourage those kinds of thoughts and values in others. Poetry doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every time we write a poem and publish a poem, we are sending something out into the world which is going to encourage other people, not necessarily to blindly follow us, but to take and consider our words and have them affect them in some way. And so when you're writing poems, you have to always be keeping in mind how you want to affect people, what you want them to be thinking about.
Absolutely. And we are going to get to formal introductions at one point, but that's we have to follow up on that. If Elijah, you just put out recently, you put out some manifestos, some polemics, some follow-up manifestos, which is really fun. The Monumentalist Manifesto, the Iron Liar. Based on what you just said, what has been the crystallized message over the last decades in the poetry or literary world?
Well, I think we
what you have in mind.
We live in a time that a friend of mine calls the proliferation, which I think is pretty apt, where there's just a sea of everything you could possibly imagine. Like any special interest you have, any particular hobby you might have, any specific subject you might be interested in, you can find a place for it on the internet. And so that can be a bit overwhelming. And so I think that, the glory of that obviously is that, you can find your people, whether they're across the world or, in your town. But the downside is that it's really hard to find the good stuff. And we don't have a lot of people saying, here's how you can find the good stuff. And in general, like if we're talking about the academy, which is becoming less and less relevant, there is still very much a sense of, and if we look even at the poems and books of poetry that are winning prizes and things like that, like there is still a kind of orthodoxy, despite the proliferation that we see online and in people's interests. There is a sense of, free versus the norm. Writing about some quotidian episode of my life is the norm, or writing about my identity is the norm, or writing about one of my an emotion or thing that's bothering me is the norm. And that comes out. It's complicated. Like we are, I think, postmodern. We're still affected by postmodernism in a lot of ways. One of those ways is, a sense of, I think, crippling irony. Like it's hard for us to try to do something grand in earnest. There's still a lot of backlash against doing that. People have a lot of doubts about their ability to make something meaningful and have it be truly meaningful, have it be true for more than just themselves. But at the same time, there is a backlash against that, I think, in sort of the more identity focused, social justice focused work that we see now, which is, in a way, a kind of new naivety, a sort of breaking away from postmodern decadence, but not necessarily in a way that I would, that I think is helpful. I think it's going into a different kind of decadence almost. Like, if you take Derrida on one side and Rupi Kaur on the other side, like I don't want either of those things. Um, I think that what we need to do now is recognize, okay, if we want poetry to be relevant to people now, but we also want it to be powerful and lasting, what can we do? And I don't think the answer is to look back and at periods where poetry was extremely popular and, a lot of lasting works were being made and say, oh, we need to copy exactly that. But I think it is helpful to look at those time periods and say, what is the kind of thing that they're doing? What are the sort of ambitions that they're striving for? What is the scope of the artworks that they're making? And how can we bring that into the 21st century? How can we look at the flaws that we see in contemporary work, whether it be a naive overabundance of emotionalism and narcissism, or a sort of lingering language poetry sense of poetry as deconstructed nonsense or attempts at meaning that never get to meaning. How can we look at that and say, where's the alternative? And I think the alternative is in looking at works of the more past and saying, these are works that have still lasted. These are works that are still being read and enjoyed. We see novels being written now and movies being made now that capture a lot of the same ambition and scope of those works. Why isn't poetry doing that? And how can we make poetry do that? How can we be inspired by the past, not to ape the past, but to write poetry that can permeate our entire culture and not just be caught in some loop of self-aggrandizement in one
Right. So,
domain or another.
so you're saying that if I write a poem about that time me and my cat stayed in for Valentine's and had some wine and, well, she had some milk, she's a cat, right? You're saying that's not sublime? That can't be Homeric? That's quotidian?
Well, it is quotidian. I'm not saying you should never write that poem, but I think that if
I
you
would
think
never write that poem, by the way. That never even happened. I don't even have a cat, but yeah.
right, I
I've
mean, and
read
there's
stuff
also
like that. I've read stuff like that. So
yeah, and I think there's you have to also really make the distinction between poetry written for yourself versus poetry written for others. And I think if you're writing for yourself, make your poetry as diaristic and formless as you want. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, if it's something that's going to help get you through the day, that's fine. Do that. If it's working as a form of therapy, all, power to you. But once you start putting work out into the world, once you start sharing it, then you have a yoke of responsibility that automatically falls upon your shoulders because you are now affecting the culture. It's going to be in an absolutely minute way, but you still are affecting the culture. And as such, you need to be thinking about what you're saying and whether what you're saying embodies a way of thinking and embodies values that are going to help people, that are going to make the world one of better and higher discernment, uh, better and higher striving. And yeah, so I don't think that there's no place for, I love my cats. I'm inspired by my cats to write poems sometimes.
yeah,
And so I think there's a place for, a poetry about some small thing that happened in your day. But when you have millions of people just flushing these poems out into the world, and I think people get lost. They don't know what poetry is. They don't know what to look for. Everyone just wants to talk about themselves. They want to talk about the small things that happened in their day. And we get no landmarks. There are no works of literature that emerge, or if they do, we don't see them, where people can be like, oh yeah, that is a great and lasting example of poetry which can inspire me throughout my life, which I can always return to, which can teach me something about the human condition. And I mean, that's what I want. I think that's what a lot of other people want as well. So, you can write little poems to amuse yourself, but I think we also, what we are sorely lacking is poetry that really aims to not make a difference in like a social justice or political way. I think it's a little naive to think that poetry can do that in this moment, but to make poetry that really teaches us something about ourselves, that enriches reality in a profound way. And that's the poetry we should be writing, whether it's in lyric or dramatic form or an epic form. And people after reading my essays, The Iron Liar and the Monumentalist Manifesto, I think some people have this idea that I only want poetry to be epic, or I only want it to be long form, which is not true. I think that we need more of those long form poems, because so few of them that are any good exist. And so much of our poetry of the past that has been grand and great and lasting and beautiful has been in those forms. And I think there's more potential for those forms to be used. But also, I think that lyric has endless potential too, and we can reform lyric, at the same time that we're bringing back drama and epic.
Yes.
I think one of the issues is that the forms that you talked about in the Iron Liar are, are longer, and so you're also competing with attention spans of people. And so that's where the Insta poets have emerged, because you have a short amount of time. It's there on the screen, a little bit easily digestible. It's kind of like the junk food of language. It's like almost like sloganeering. But there is so much room for beautiful moments in life to be depicted. I mean, Richard Wilbur is one of my favorite poets,
He's one of my
and
favorite poets too.
yeah, he's amazing. And when I encounter like his one of my favorite poems is actually the writer. There's a typewriter that features prominently in there, and a couple of my daughters like to type on this, and so um, these poems, when they're so well crafted, they just kind of attach to you like burrs, when you're just walking through a forest. And I mean, I can recite the writer from memory. In her room at the prow of the house, where the light breaks and the windows are tossed with linden, my daughter is writing a story. I pause. Oh, wait a second. Let me see if I can get it. But I love this poem so much. I pause in the stairwell, hearing by her shut door a commotion of typewriter keys like a chain hauled over a gunwale. Young as she is, the stuff of her life is a great cargo, and some of it heavy. I wish her a lucky passage. But now it is she who pauses, as if to reject my thought and its easy figure. A stillness greatens in which the whole house seems to be thinking. And then she is at it again in a bunched clamor of strokes, and is once again silent. I remember the dazed starling, which was trapped in that very room 2 years ago, how we stole in, lifted a sash, and retreated, not to affright it, and how for a helpless hour, through the crack in the door, we watched that sleek, wild, dark, and iridescent creature batter against a brilliance, drop like a glove to the hard floor or the desktop, and wait then, humped and bloody, for the wits to try it again. And how our spirits rose when, suddenly sure, it lifted off from a chair back, beating a smooth course for the right window and clearing the sill of the world. It was always a matter, my darling, of life or death, as I had forgotten. I wish what I wished for you before, but harder.
Thank you, Zina. Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example of a poem that does take, on paper a small moment, but really it's not about it's not fetishizing that small moment for its own sake. It's saying something about life and about the human spirit. And that to me is what, monumentalism is really about. It's about finding that real nugget of truth that, that shines and can shine for your whole life, and making that what the poem's about. And that can come from a small moment in your day, or it can come from a large grand narrative. But ultimately, it's not about the passing trivial details. It's about what you can extract from that. And I think that's, the focus that we ought to have, whether we're writing lyric poems or otherwise.
The German word for poetry is Dichtung, which really means to condense, right? Condensed. And but then you get into the question, if I'm listening to the critics, and how are people going to push back? And at this level of conversation, right, you could imagine, just based on what the cursory statements made, people would say, okay, but by definition, if we're supposed to distill something, that assumes that human beings have powers of discernment that can, to some degree at least, determine what's what, right? That they can distinguish truth from falsehood or lies. And so to me, and I think this goes back to Plato, he sort of set the bar in the Republic when he's talking about the poets, because you are, Elijah, and many of us are talking about looking to the past, to the greatest traditions, in order to sort of inspire ourselves in and how we're thinking about building the future of the literary world. But Plato, he took the poets to task, right? He was saying that unless poetry could actually imitate what's true, right? It wasn't just mimesis and imitation of life as it appears or life as it is for people in a given time. If there wasn't some higher transcendent quality to the verse, it was a problem, right? Because people, sure, they have catharsis and, oh, they have this transformative experience. They go to the Dionysia or whatnot. But in those powerful, transformative, highly emotive moments, they take on new ideas. So what if those ideas are not correct? Are you even allowed to say that? We're in 2025. Are we still not allowed to judge not only the quality of, let's say, the technical craft, but the quality of an idea, right? The validity or correctness of an idea. And does that have any relationship to beauty? And I think here, based on what you're saying, it begs the question, if we're going to condense things, are we just going to condense things for the sake of, this is what I took away from, my experience at the self-checkout, and then the ponerology of self-checkout and plasticless bags or something. I could condense that. So when we're talking about condensing and distilling things and meaning, is this based on some recognition that human beings have reason, right? Made in the likeness of their creator, which is God has absolute reason, right? And man is in his likeness. So therefore, man, in a contracted sense, has powers of discernment. That's really the only thing that distinguishes him from from the beasts, if you will. Like if it's just experience, if it's just logic, people love to say rationalism, logic, but okay, if dog goes place A, gets punished, goes place B, gets rewarded, he knows that place B is good, place A is bad. Human beings, reward and punishment, if you have a legalistic education or justice system, you can train people to know what's what, but that doesn't get to the higher what's what, if you will. And is that not in question in what you're saying? Unless people can do that, and we have a certain image of human beings capable of doing that, as Plato suggested.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that you don't have to have an image of man as the image of God to believe that humans have reason. And I think that if you can question whether humans have reason all day, and there are obviously things that we can't know. There are things which are beyond our scope of rationality about the world, which you would expect in an infinite, eternal world. We have serious limitations, but within our scope, I think if you look, into yourself, into your mind, and you see the accomplishments which human beings have done over the course of history, you could see that we do have a capacity to reason. And if you want to be able to make any arguments at all, you have to use reason. It's something that's almost forced upon you. I think that, what you're talking about, like being trained to do X or Y, that's like behaviorism, which, I don't, it's not something psychologists really use anymore. But I do think that reason is a spectrum. I don't think it's something that we have and that animals don't have at all. I think, animal consciousness is something we barely understand. The question has often been asked whether humans are smart enough to understand how smart animals are. And I think we don't know. there's a lot that we don't know. And obviously we can't get inside their minds because consciousness is this weird thing which is not subject to material analysis. It's not subject to science. But yeah, I mean, when I look at what elephants or baboons or orcas are capable of, I mean, some of it's really incredible, and I think it really connects us to the chain of life. To look at how animals are similar to us, how we are similar to animals, and we can. I mean, so much of what art is about is reminding us and showing us both the immense potential that we have and also the immense limitations and failures that we have. The animalistic parts of us which sometimes win out, and the glorious rational triumph of the human spirit which can also win out, sometimes simultaneously, as in the case of tragedy, when someone can become so abased, so destitute, so lost, and at the same time have an incredible strength of character which carries through and which even might lead them to a kind of mystical sense of enlightenment at the end, where they understand the nature of reality. They understand God better through having gone through this incredible suffering. And so much of what, and another thing that, I mean, I think is essential to art is having us deal with this weird thing that is being in the world, and how much suffering it can cause us and how to deal with that suffering. So much of art is about calibrating us to the world, having us be able to accept the world as it is. And I think good art does that. Art that is not so good often tries to distort what the world is or distort what human nature is. And that can lead us astray. I mean, I agree with Plato on that. But if the art is good, and this is something Aristotle understood better than Plato, it can really elevate us. It can teach us wisdom. And that is something that I always strive for in art. That's something I always look for in art. If I read a poet and I don't respect them as a thinker, then I might say, yeah, they're doing something pretty here, but I'm not going to read much of it because I don't think it has that value that I want.
That's
And
pretty
also,
interesting. And let's Zina maybe chime in on the same thing, right? In terms of, because we brought up this question, I brought up this question of truth and poetry, and Elijah's made some good points. So, I mean, where are you on this? Or do you think about it?
Completely different place.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
it's
I was
just
just gonna say, so am I. I'm on you said Aristotle understood the question better than Plato. I'm on the complete other end of the spectrum. So that's interesting, right? Because we liken us, our things we say resonate a lot. So it'll be interesting to get into that. But Zina, yeah, where
I think my audience in terms of my Substack and just in general approach poetry in a different way, and I work in a place where I take care of young children. That's my what I'm paid to do. That's where I get my paycheck. So a lot of the people I'm around are about 3 years old to 5 years old, and so the experience of language there is very beauty first, in that there's an experience of language that is just really joyful. And I have like if I'm holding a cranky baby, sometimes I break out into Dickinson and they're just like looking at me. And because the cadence and the rocking back and forth to that has that kind of just hypnotic quality to it. And I think that for a lot of people who are afraid of poetry or who have been told that they're bad at it or have felt like that, which is where I came from, that you just want to learn to love it for what it is, and but you also want some truth in it as well. But I mean, you remember poems like the Jabberwocky, "'Twas brillig in the slithy toes, the jar and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the borogoves and the mome-raths outgrabe." It begins with this kind of joyous sonicness, and then it goes into the caution, beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch, you know, and then it ends with this beautiful turn towards, come to my arms, my beamish boy, O frabjous stay, Callooh, Calais, he chortled in his joy. That return. I mean, obviously, this is also a poem that I've read to my children as well. And and they hear this kind of reassurance in the sussin, like tiger, tiger burning bright in the forest of the night. and it has the same cadence as Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and so you could actually sing it to that tune as well, which is what I've done. So Tiger, Tiger, burning bright. You know, it's the a lot of people don't get to experience this one particular thing about formal poetry that is unlike any other experience of language, which is that that strong meter, that like drum-like dance
Mm.
that language has, and that it is a joy to introduce people to that, that you can hear the music in this language and ballad meter. Like there's so much of metered poetry which had fallen by the wayside for such a long time. And like in our current poetry right now, so dominated by free verse that you don't hear that. But that's one of the things that can make poetry incredibly special. And that you know, I was thinking that Four Weddings and a Funeral had Auden in it, and that particular, and Auden was an incredibly musical poet, and but it's such a desperate and heartbreaking poem that I love it when you do that cross-pollination, and that I was like trying to think of other ways in which poetry does kind of the come outside of its silo, outside of its bubble. And I remember when the Challenger had had blown up and Reagan had this speech, and there was this part at towards the end where he says that, and I actually printed it out so I could read it because it's also
I love a good
very much
speech.
in pentameter.
Uh,
Yeah, a political speech. Good political speeches are actually strongly iambic,
right, for
you
sure.
know?
That's the natural cadence of the English language, right? That's why it's not arbitrary that,
Yeah.
English sonnets are written in iambic pentameter, right? It's right there. It's not arbitrary, which people seem to even.
It kind of we don't always speak in, iambs, but when you do it for a block, it has an incantatory effect, and you listen much better and you can remember much better. And in fact, this happened a long time ago, and I still like remember the last parts of it, but I printed out the last paragraph of it, that the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Mm, mm,
And
Yeah. Yeah, that's great, Zena. I mean, I completely agree with you. I don't really see how you're disagreeing with me
oh,
because
no, 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 I'm not. But
I
in the
wasn't.
sense that I'm basically saying, though, I'm just changing like in order to, or I'm like highlighting the importance of the beauty of the language. The experience of the language itself
Oh,
comes
of
first
course.
before the meaning, before we have to have
Hmm.
this message. It has to be about this identity. It has to be about all these different things. And I'm speaking as a non-white woman who is a first generation American who could capitalize on, on this if I wanted to and write like this tortured, you know, free verse that's
right.
down with the patriarchy and everything's, you know, about colonization. And, and that's, you know, I, for me, there are aspects to what I've gone through that are different, certainly, and inform my life. But I mean, much to the way that Richard Wilbur had a daughter who was a writer, and that informing him that connection with the quotidian, but then that turn into the day starling and knowing how to use metaphor, how to use image, and how to use the musicality of language to convey that. That's the difference. He could have written that in prose and it would be beautiful, and you would still cry at the end because he loves his daughter, but it wouldn't be real artistic poetry of a high level.
Well,
And
you certainly don't have to convince me of the
oh
value
yeah.
of beautiful formal poetry. No, I'm definitely not arguing that I prize content without form, or that form should be sacrificed for content. I mean, I make Versecraft, for God's sake. Like, I think that both need to be combined effectively. Like, they reinforce each other. I value beautiful, disciplined, architectonic, technically accomplished form, partly because it does, as you say, elevate what's being said to such a degree. It adds an emotional quality to it. It adds a dynamic quality to it, which would be an incantatory, mnemonic quality to it, which would be absent otherwise. That's why I think it's so important. And I look for beauty in my poetry always. And if there's not beauty, I think that's a real flaw. I'm just saying that I look for both pretty much equally. I don't think that one should be sacrificed for the other. On the one hand, I don't want a poem that's about something important, but that's basically in prose and it's just pretending to be a poem. On the other hand, I don't, yeah, I'm maybe less sympathetic than you to a poem that is just pure incantation, like something of Poe or something by Lewis Carroll or something like that. Like, I understand the value of that, but to me, the value of that is lesser and substantially lesser than a poem which is able to intricately and beautifully weave, formal music and something philosophically profound together. The purely aesthetic poem, the purely formally delightful poem that isn't saying much, it has the value it has is hedonistic, pretty much. Like, it's a pure sensual pleasure, which is fine. I mean, there's plenty of hedonistic or hedonic pleasures that we need in life to stay sane, but it's not the highest that we're capable of. And ultimately, what I seek in poetry is the highest that we're capable of. I know that I am mortal and that my life is short. So the poems that I want to consume are going to be the poems that give me the most bang for their buck all the time.
Right. And that's a fun way to put it. I often like to think when I'm having philosophical debates or whatnot, nobody's saying don't have a cookie. You know what I mean? Sometimes, sure, they're being able to recognize that there are higher and lower emotions, there is high art and lower degrees of artistic expression, is not to call for a new Tsarist regime, right? Which is how a lot of people, I think this is part of the problem as well. We all of us have talked about the problems of the modern aesthetic consciousness. And I would say, though, one of them is also just the fact that uh, people have been so propagandized, the propaganda addled brains, right, of the average American or Westerner is crazy. And so things have become so polarized that you get a lot of overcorrection, right? You go from like something really extreme radical left, anything goes, do as thou wilt, to the nth degree, and then it's like it swings to like full blown full hog demonology and a supernatural war that like a Walmart mom thinks she's all of a sudden a part of. And people are, just as Plato described, they're amped up by images. And so from on a more conservative side, people will get amped up by religious images. And there's all sorts of bad actors that have done that historically. And so there's always, if we think of, well, where does art, right? Isn't art meant to reintroduce a balance and power of discernment, but as well that's why you need beauty, because beauty is the invitation, right? Beauty is an invitation to something higher. I think some people may stop short, right, in their aesthetic theories where there's like, it's beauty. You got to feel something. It has to be cathartic. But at the same time, okay, but is that then sort of opening a door to something truthful, or is it just like a feeling? And if you don't have that, I mean, then art, again, it becomes easily weaponized. People are propagandized, and art will just sort of mirror whatever they believe, right? So shouldn't art, if I had to condense it, I think great art is often about tearing down illusions. And so, of course, there's beauty. There's beauty is the invitation to do that, but there's also the sublime. You know, Schiller, who I talk a lot about, Elijah, you had mentioned one of the essays I wrote on tragedy. He makes a distinction between beauty and the sublime. And some people get upset when I always bring up Schiller because he is, oh, this old dude, and he's just talking about the Greeks a lot. But he just makes the distinction that the beautiful and the sublime are two different things. And he has a poem, The Guides of Life, where he's saying if you just lived your life for beauty and according to aesthetic principles of beauty, you can think of a slothful or indolent or very opulent, decadent, Baroque or Roman Empire. Sure, it's nice, right? The emperors have nice things. If you go to the Rothschilds' mansion, they have tons of nice things. The clam chowder is out of this world, right? The gazpacho is top notch, but there has to be more. So Schiller, the sublime is also that thing that tears you away from that comfort and just that pure sensory bliss. And he's saying the perfect art, as in the perfect light, is a marriage. Perfect life is a marriage of beauty and the sublime. And if you just have one, you shouldn't trust one for your happiness, beauty, and you shouldn't trust the other for your luck. The sublime may take you to some places you don't want to go, and beauty may seduce you or try to keep you in places that you shouldn't remain. Am I wrong? Like, can
No,
people
I mean,
not overcorrect? And is it not important to, if we want to see the highest level of poetry and tragic art, don't these distinctions have to be made?
yeah, well, you know that I advocate for the sublime. I think that that's one of the things that we are missing most in contemporary poetry, and which I would love to be able to bring back. I don't think that I don't think that beauty and the sublime are necessarily opposed to one another. I think that often you can achieve the sublime through an intensification of beauty. It's not the beauty of like little twinkly flowers. It's the beauty of, an iambic line just building and building and building momentum. And then you reach heights where you're talking about something, grand or important, and you're just like, whoa, like the top of my head's been being taken off. And also I think it's important to remind listeners that the sublime is uncanny because it's not just about being uncomfortable. It's about there being a pleasure in being uncomfortable. It's about a sense of, oh my God, like this is real, this is true, this is overwhelming, and it's scary, but I also am kind of in bliss. And it's confusing because you're in a state of exaltation while you're also being terrified. And that's what the sublime is. Like just terror or just fright on its own is not the sublime. Sublime is when you almost reach a pitch of beauty that is so overwhelming that you can't take it anymore. And beauty itself almost becomes scary.
Right.
Like,
I'll read. So Schiller has a great quote on, I think that just kind of describes what you did. So you did a pretty good job here. The feeling of the sublime is a mixed feeling. It is a combination of woefulness, which expresses itself in its highest degree as a shudder, and of joyfulness, which can rise up to rapture. Although it is not properly pleasure, it is yet widely preferred to every pleasure by fine souls. This union of two contradictory sentiments in a single feeling proves our moral independence in an irrefutable manner. For as it is absolutely impossible that the same objects stand in two opposite relations to us, so does it follow, therefore, that we ourselves stand in two different relations to the object, so that consequently two opposite natures must be united in us, which are interested in the conception of the same in completely opposite ways. We therefore experience, through the feeling of the sublime, that the state of our mind does not necessarily conform to the state of the senses, that the laws of nature are not necessarily also those of ours, and that we have in us an independent principle, which is independent of all sensuous emotions. I think that's very useful. And yeah, like I just concur with what you say. Beauty again is the sort of, you need a sensuous image, even if you're going to get to something super sensuous or transcendent, right? We're human beings by their sort of sensual nature or dimensions. We can't just deal in abstracts, right? Poets are image makers, right? Poesis is image making. But I find it useful that Schiller really goes out of his way to make those distinctions. As you know, Elijah, you're the new Sublime. I like that. The new Sublime. I could get behind that. That's cool. And the fact that you're that somehow metal played in inspired, that's fun. You know, that's why when I read that your essay, I was like, wow, this guy's, he's a fun guy. You know, you can tell he's really thinking about it. Why don't
It's
we,
Well,
excellent
thank you.
branding. Yeah.
yeah, let's read some poems on that note.
Yeah.
We could go on for a while, and I think we do want to give people you know,
Well, I have a poem that kind of piggybacks off of that in terms of the sublime, and also that connection to the divine and to God. Because I mean, I think of the metaphysical poets, but I also think about Gerald Manley Hopkins, and Pied Beauty is one of those poems that speaks to that. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple colors, a brinded cow, for rosemows on stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finches' wings, La landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow, in all trades their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter original, spare, strange, whatever's fickle, freckled, who knows how. With swift, slow, sweet, sour, dazzle dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him.
mm,
And all those beautiful things in opposition to each other, the swift, the slow, the sweets and sour, the dappled things, the things that don't seem so beautiful but are because they're created,
mm,
and that it's a prayer. I mean, so much of poetry, so much of beautiful poetry is prayer and litanies, and of course, poetry originated as chant in religious ritual and in ceremonies as well. And so I think one of the reasons why poetry is somewhat degraded is because one of the places where you would experience poetry is in churches and temples, and
mm,
in and as our society becomes less religious, generations become less exposed to naturally occurring poetry, like in the Psalms. I mean, I'm Catholic, and so there's a responsorial psalm. There are certain the fact that the Mass itself is a form and creates within that form something special with the words, the way that everything is just so carefully composed that it's. I used to go to Mass in American Sign Language for one of my sons, and so the sign of the cross is one complete prayer in
mm,
sign language. And
mm,
so my experience of language is actually not just sonic, but it's also incredibly physical as well. And one of the other roles that I have is as a special education advocate. So advocating for those who can't even speak for themselves
mm,
in a quite literal sense, and the importance of being able to use language to help give them rights and also help them write things on IEPs called vision statements. And one of the things that you're told as an advocate is that it's important that you be a good writer. And the more beautiful, the more poetic that you can write something, the more meaningful it is for that kid, for that family. And so there are ways in which poetry, that special use of language, can inform just about anything that we put down on paper or anything that we say. And it becomes high stakes.
and what's nice
Yeah, I
about what you're saying, Zina, is that and we've all said it in different ways though, but poetry, language is nonverbal, right? We think, and I think the overcorrection that you get when people talk about formal traditional poetry, classic poetry, they go for like this Apollonian formalism, but forgetting that, when you're speaking and you're reciting, your body is involved, right? I think Dana Joy had also, he was saying something like, get in touch with your body if you want to write good poetry. It's not just something in your head, but that's true of the greatest truths, right? If people are just talking about philosophy in some purely abstract way, and it's not high stakes, right? They haven't really had the experiences that make truth the visceral reality that it is, right? If it's just something abstract, you can also get that in poetry, right? The lines are very nice, like it's all well crafted, but there's something missing. And
That's exactly why I studied philosophy in undergrad, and that's why I changed from philosophy to poetry, because I wanted to be able to talk about philosophy in language that did philosophical concepts justice. And in order to do that, I found that the beauty and the metaphor and the ambiguity and the rhythm of poetry and the imagery that you need to sort of, these sensuous things that you need to sort of grab hold, these were all essential for me in adequately communicating and exploring philosophical ideas. The pure abstract expository is not going to cut it.
Absolutely. Why don't you read us one of your poems? I have
Sure.
or something you'd like to read. I had one that I really liked, the clarinet. That I only was able to find. I didn't get a chance to dig too. Pick what you like. The clarinet is very nice. The folk.
Sure. Well, I before I read anything, I just wanted to say, Zina, I think you hit upon something really crucial, which is that, I'm not someone who believes that we all should return to some kind of neo-Orthodox religion. I don't think that's even possible, but I do think it's true that when we lose religiosity in society, we also often lose access to religious feelings. And the sublime is a religious feeling. And so if people don't believe that religion or some kind of religious relationship to the world is possible, then the sublime is going to be barred to them. Because the sublime is a religious emotion. It is, regardless of creed, it is contact with reality in an extremely personal, extremely moving way, and a recognition of how small you are, amidst the vastness of things. And if you're not open to that kind of experience, if you don't have the humility to embrace a religious experience, period, regardless again of creed, then you're not going to get there. Yeah, so I'm happy to read one of my own poems. I happen to have the Robinson poems already pulled up, which I was planning to read. So
go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I love Robinson. He might be my favorite lyric poet. I wanted to read these two poems, The Clerks and Many Are Called, because they use extremely plain language. They're in the plain style, and they have, well, especially The Clerks has some very, consciously quotidian imagery in it, but they just they put you into the stratosphere by the end. And I love the way that he's able to do that. So this is The Clerks by E.A. Robinson. I did not think that I should find them there when I came back again. But there they stood, as in the days they dreamed of, when young blood was in their cheeks and women called them fair. Be sure, they met me with an ancient air, and yes, there was a shop-worn brotherhood about them. But the men were just as good and just as human as they ever were. And you, that ache so much to be sublime, and you that feed yourself with your descent, what comes of all your visions and your fears? Poets and kings are but the clerks of time, tearing the same dull webs of discontent, clipping the same sad alnage of the years. And so what I love about that is, I write all these essays about the sublime, and he's accusatory. He's like, oh, you poets who think you're this hot shit, like, you have to recognize you're just a clerk in another sense. You're a clerk maybe on a higher domain of abstraction, which is itself sublime. It is itself sublime to think about that. And that's what I love about it, is that, like, it is a very healthful corrective to people who think too much of themselves or think too much of the vocation that they've chosen for themselves. And at the same time, it's like, whoa, like, yes, we are all just clerks of time, no matter how famous or immortal we become, no matter, what thunderous verses we write, it's still such a small job in the scheme of things. And so, it can keep you humble, it can realign your priorities and also give you that sublime sense, which I love. And, again, it's in this very plain language. It focuses on clerks, an extremely, kind of dusty quotidian image, but it's just great. And then he has this other wonderful poem about art called Many Are Called, which goes like this. The Lord Apollo, who has never died, still holds alone his immemorial reign, supreme, in an impregnable domain that with his magic he has fortified. And though melodious multitudes have tried, in ecstasy, in anguish, and in vain, with invocation sacred and profane to lure him, even the loudest are outside. Only at unconjectured intervals, by will of him on whom no man may gaze, by word of him whose law no man has read, a questing light may rift the sullen walls to cling where mostly its infrequent rays fall golden on the patience of the dead. So again, I mean, this is a monumental poem. It's describing this Apollonian shrine with Apollo in it. It's inaccessible. It's like extremely numinous, this image. And he's talking about the vanity of most people who try to enter into Apollo's domain, who try to get a seat at Parnassus.
Mm.
And so again, it's about humbling yourself, having adequate expectations of what you can accomplish. But this one is a little bit more optimistic. And then at the end, he's saying, but there are some, rare moments. These people have never looked on Apollo. It's undeserved, but they're able to pierce through, and they're able to make something lasting. And I love that too, and that's inspiring. And it reminds you that, hey, you should not expect anything to come out of all the labor you're doing. You can't. Like, this is Apollo you're dealing with. You've never seen him. But there is always that small glimmer of hope that something will happen. And you should not let that glimmer of hope deceive you into thinking that you're destined for anything. Right. But if what you seek is, to have some ray of light reach through those chinks, that's what you have to do. And that is a grand mission, even if at the end of the day, you're just a clerk of time.
I love that. Beautiful. And yeah, I think that really speaks to the kind of aesthetic and, like you said, the monumental vision. That doesn't mean, yeah, you need to build the Eiffel Tower next door, right? Just because you want to do something monumental. But it's very profound. That was very beautiful. I always think halfway through these discussions, I'm like, we should have started reading poetry earlier. Like this is. So we always start with the more contentious stuff, but no, that's really beautiful. Do you have, Zina, anything else
actually, I had an E.A. Robinson poem up as well, because I wanted to talk a bit about narrative poetry in addition to epic poetry and that the sublime, and that narrative poetry I think is a style that could compete with today's literature because it is so condensed, because you can make it so emotional and so tight and so economical in a way that novels. I mean, I just some novels I read and there just seem to be so much more in there than there needs to be, and that a tightly woven narrative is something of the I think is incredibly beautiful. And so Richard Cory is one of those poems that's very tightly crafted, and it is probably his most famous one. I know if people know a Richard Robinson poem, it's Richard Cory, and so I just thought I'd read it and also maybe talk about The Gleaning too by Jared Carter, which I know I had sent to you guys before. But here's Richard Cory. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said, "Good morning," and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head.
Robinson's the best. Yeah.
He's and that's a story, and that's a narrative. And when we talk about like the poems should have a message or should, have some type of lesson or teach people things, that this does in a way tell us a lot about the human condition and about how hidden that that darkness of the soul is, and a reminder to all of us to kind of care about people, like, and to see them. You may think that the grass is greener on the other side, but you know, you don't know what's inside somebody else's head. And that idea of empathy, though, too, is something that, especially post pandemic, that I see a lot of kids struggle with trying to communicate with each other and try to relate to each other. And that we need more in-person type of contact and that type of skill building. I mean, because there's
Right.
a lot of skill building that needs to take place.
And narrative literature is almost engineered to produce empathy. I think there are people who are striving for connection in poetry, who are trying to get it through this sort of confessional style. I'm pouring forth my truth so that you can respond to it in some way. But that itself is like an incredibly selfish endeavor. And really what it does is it just encourages other people to be like, oh, well, I could do that too. And I'm going to pour forth all my feelings. And so everyone actually becomes it's striving for connection. And maybe for some people it does produce connection, but I think it also encourages a culture of narcissism and people just becoming more and more insulated inside themselves and just thinking more and more about their own shit. But narrative work, whether it's prose or poetry, it it's a hypothetical exercise. It puts you into this scenario that you have never lived, but it's asking you to relate to characters. It's asking you to think about what you would do in a certain situation or how you feel about the fact that a character just did X, Y, and Z. And so yeah, I mean, we need that in poetry. We need that in general. I mean, the encouragement of empathy, the thinking the thoughts of others. I mean, thinking the thoughts of others is really what all literature is. The one of the most glorious things about poetry is that we all only have one life to live. But what literature allows for is for us to get some of the best thoughts of all these other people who have lived all these other lives and experience them in our own life. We get to live the best parts, the best thoughts of thousands of other people when we read literature. I mean, it's an amazing thing that humans have invented for that reason alone. But yeah, I totally agree with you
And if
that we need
someone were
more.
to push back on you, I love what you're saying, Elijah. But if someone were to push back though and say, okay, you're saying there's all these great thoughts, but so you're saying people don't have great thoughts today? Like they're all the great thoughts are just they were in the past, and for some reason people are just shitty now and they don't have great
Well,
thoughts, or what happened, right?
no, I think people do have great thoughts. I think that there's less impetus for them to put them in forms that will last and to
Mm,
develop them into concepts that are going to be compelling. Like, we there's this concept. I've talked about this with Matthew Buckley Smith on Sleet Ricketts once, of golden ages. There are periods of time where almost inexplicably a bunch of people arise who are just really talented and really good at what they do. You see this in Renaissance Italy. You see this, in your favorite Weimar classicism. It's just like, where did all these people come from? They're all so good, and they all know each other. They're all friends. It's like, how did this happen?
yeah.
It's because the environment was conducive to it. We always have this potential in us at every point in history, in every generation. There are always figures who, given the right push, given the right incentive, can grow into these great figures. It's just that there are lots of periods of history where there's a lull in, there seems to be a lull in talent because the conditions are not right. There's not enough of a motivation for people to, go to music school and become great musicians and compete with other great musicians or poets or painters or whoever. There's not the prestige and there's not the market for it. There's not the desire. There's not the energy.
Right.
And so part of what I'm trying to do in my criticism is create some of that energy. Is try to get some momentum going, try to get people to think about, oh, I could write something great. I could write something that can compete with the greatness of the past. Because the more we have people doing that, like, as Robinson would tell you, and as I would tell you, most of them are going to fail. But as long as we have more and more and more people doing that, that's going to create a culture in which the best can really rise. And that's what I want. I want to, it might be foolhardy to even try to create an artificial golden age, but I think we need to do everything we can to push culture in that direction.
No, I love the way you've thought about it, Elijah, and I this idea of sparking the enthusiasm. Yeah, here, and I think you're doing a great job. Just listening to you and what you've written, it's enthusiasm is contagious as well, right? We can talk about all the high, or high loftier but abstract ideals, but if you don't have the enthusiasm, people are like, yeah, sure, I believe that, but here we are in the shitty 21st century or something, right? But if there's that enthusiasm, people can surprise themselves, right? People will surprise us. Things will come from places that weren't expected because there's the spark, has been lit. So yeah.
Right. I mean, you can be the strongest man in the world, but if you are bound in mind forged manacles, you're not going to get to show your strength.
Yeah. Those
There
electric
was a disagreement that I had with somebody about Rupi Kaur, um, in that it wasn't really about her poetry, but one of my friends said, "Oh, she has nothing to say," and I kind of said, "No, I think she has plenty to say. She's just not being rewarded for saying it very well," and that when you financially reward people for being content producers as opposed to artists, then you are signaling to the rest of society that we're going to pay money for this, but not for this. So create this. But the experiences that we all feel as human beings are still there. We still feel all these grand things and have a potential for feeling the sublime and to being able to articulate it. But in the case of a lot of people that we're not taught how to do it. I mean, I'm in an MFA program right now, and I could not write in meter whatsoever. I mean, I tried and tried. I got the Timothy Steele book, and I tried to teach myself. And the my frustration with learning the craft of poetry, and for me, it had to be in this type of academic setting, is very much like my frustration with having 5 children and only being able to afford to pay music lessons for one or two of them at a time. And trying to make that decision when you have finite resources, when the access to training is so limited and gets more and more expensive because the teachers are musicians and you want them to be paid for, or you don't want your kid to, you know, get an education on the backs of, somebody else suffering, just because it's art and you think that it should be free. That I think that there's this tension as well as creating good artists requires having good artists to learn from, and that when you have a smaller pool of people who can write in a certain way and are trained in a certain way to write in form and know how to teach it too. Just because you can write doesn't mean that you're also a very good teacher at it, you know? And so I think that's also something that we have to talk about. Like, how do we make more poets? And although so many people can't reach that highest level of creating art. To learn how to write poetry is a way to learn to appreciate the craft when you do see it done well. So, and I think that's also part of the other thing. I mean, I wrote about not having a great education in poetry, and I was basically spite reading Dana Gioia because my professor didn't like like him, and so it's but that's usually not how people learn poetry. They usually have a good teacher of poetry, and they inspire kids to get really into it and all of that. And my unusual story is that it came inversely. But yeah, because I work with so many little kids and I have, children myself, it's interesting for me to see the difference between my 22-year-old and my 9-year-old, that my 9-year-old and my middle schooler, something changed in their curriculum and they know poetry. They can scan it. And I wonder if it's particular to my district or if there is some type of slow movement towards introducing kids to Frost and Dickinson and to all that because my middle schooler actually likes Poe. Because I mean, there's something gothic about it. She drew pictures of ravens for a while, and they were all over the place. But that joy in experiencing these kind of dark stories it's in a way very metal also, like those deep feelings of being
Mhm.
scared, and the images that a lot of times I think that you do have to get them young as well. And so that's where we can kind of focus some of our time.
Yes, absolutely. I, if I was the dictator of the United States, then I would put so much money into education. That's what I would do. I would, whatever the pie chart of the budget is, I would make a huge slice of it education. And of course, try to get it as equitably distributed as possible. But yeah, I mean, it's so critical. I mean, and that's, Versecraft is an educational enterprise. That's why, I don't, it's certainly not geared towards little kids, but it is an attempt to just try to encourage, good conversations and good poetry being written by just teaching people things. Like they just need to be taught the things first, right? Like that's the bare minimum. If Mozart was not taught music, he would not have become a musician.
Right.
Like you just need to keep teaching people things, and the more people are well educated, then the more people will be able to do these great things that we can admire for centuries.
Amen.
That's also where we get patrons as well. I mean, when you have people who do have the funds um, to support artists, I mean, they do so because they were educated. They know how important it is as well. And patrons are the breath that fans the flame of culture,
Yeah, and
you
I
know?
mean, today's aristocrats suck. Like they're the worst. Man, like there are people
Yachts?
with
Really?
that there are people Pluto, I mean, they're not really, I mean, aristocrats is to flatter them. These plutocrats, these technocrats, with just insane amounts of wealth, e- ethically unconscionable amounts of wealth, obviously. But, at least if they're going to have that much wealth, they're going to manipulate so many people to get all of this wealth, they might as well do something good with it, and they don't. They so often don't. Like, at least, I'm not going to argue for the virtue of someone like JP Morgan or Andrew Carnegie, but they built beautiful things. They funded museums and they funded artists and they collected art, and you can go to the Morgan and see how gorgeous it is and how beautiful that collection is. You can go to Pittsburgh and go to the Carnegie Museum and see that amazing collection. There's philanthropy, which is great in itself, but then there's also this artistic patronage, which we have so little of now. And these these new money plutocrats have no taste. They've never developed any taste. And what taste they show is based entirely on markets, basically. Like if they buy a painting, it's because it was worth, $200 million. and they want to use it as a bargaining piece, or they want to use it as a show of conspicuous consumption. Like there's no discernment involved.
There's no
So yeah,
appreciation. Yeah.
right. I mean, if we, you know, I think that billionaires should not exist. But if we're going to have billionaires, it would at least be, it would be extremely helpful if those billionaires, were able to be these patrons like the Medici or the Borgia or Andrew Carnegie or JP Morgan. That alone, if we had any of that, would change the artistic situation we have in America and around the world dramatically.
Mhm.
Well, one of the ironies, though, as well, is that I don't know if you guys have ever read the Cultural Cold War book, The CIA in the World of Arts and Letters. That's a fun read. And I mean, a lot of modern art was highly subsidized, like highly, highly. And so it did create a life of its own by subsidizing a lot of, I mean, most of it, to be honest, right? Whether there is things like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, whether it's Rothko, Pollock, or all these guys, like they would have still been doing their things, but these things were artificially elevated, and that created a certain cultural process, and it took on a life of its own. So, if anything, though, yeah, that certain arts, plutocrats were funding certain arts, but there was a change in the aesthetic taste, which arguably had all sorts, or maybe it was economic, maybe it was, Hunter Biden style money laundering or whatever's going on, right? Selling your toothbrush paintings or something. But yeah, there was that. So technically, I mean, if there are any well-meaning aristocrats out there, they should, yeah, there should be patronage of good art, I guess is what's kind of being said here. But that isn't that the interesting thing, that today we're kind of in the Wild West where things are, you got everything, but people can also build up their own platforms, right? They can create their own networks. So it requires a different kind of culture, right? It's not necessarily going to be the Medici, though that would be nice, and maybe they'll come in at some point. But wouldn't you say there's a different kind of opportunity now? Is that possible?
Totally. I mean, it's a total double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's amazing that we can have all the platforms that we do, and that I'm able to make something like Versecraft sort of out of the blue, or have a Substack, and that you can have your magazine and your Substack, and Zina can have her Substack, and it's all great. But of course, that creates the problem of like everyone has a voice and everyone's out there screaming all the time. And there's this super abundance of content, and it's so hard to. I mean, I think if you really know what you want to look for, you can find it. But there's so much, we live in a sort of economy of attention, and
Mm.
there's so many people who want your attention all the time, and that can be overwhelming, and it can be really hard to achieve any kind of consensus or establish any kind of criteria about like, oh, here's the page of art that we're going to be on, here's what we should strive for, when there are so many competing voices. And you were talking about fiefdoms in your previous episode. We kind of have to have those, because otherwise we're just going to be lost in the sea of chaotic voices everywhere. We sort of need to establish realms where, certain people agree on something so that they're able to actually get anything done. I mean, just like a government, like we can't have a pure democracy in the US because it would be too many voices. We need to condense a little bit.
Well,
And
that's what's
so
nice about these fireside chats, is that people do get to sort of float different ideas. And you said one of them before we started recording, Elijah. I think poetry films, right? Capturing the multimedia, the audiovisual dimension, that's just part of our culture. So it's only natural for poetry to encroach on that world in a way that ideally fulfills the highest ideals of poetry. So like we did one film in a church of Dana Joya's The Angel with the Broken Wing. It was first one. I would have done certain things different, but the idea that you could make a whole series of films and all sorts of things, right? I think it's a changing world, so we do need to adapt. But if we adapt, it's like, hey, we can make crazy, awesome poetry films. Like we can make really, really cool stuff, and in
yeah,
a way that was not possible if you had to rely on, you know,
studios.
MGM or
Yeah.
whatnot 50 years ago. So that's cool, and that's all new, right? Independent Hollywood's also starting to be a thing. So yeah, it seems like we're in a crossroads for sure.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting things that I think has become apparent over the last few years is that in film and in TV shows, I think also, we were seeing a real rejection of realism. Uh, there are horror films and fantasy series and sci-fi series which, are taking the world by storm.
Mhm.
People are less interested in seeing slice of life style things than something that is sort of big and epic or strange in some way. And I think that that can provide a great opportunity for poetry to follow suit. Poetry doesn't have to be, you journaling about the thing that happened to you today and try to make it as, authentically real as possible. Like it can be something imaginative. And if we're able to bring in poetry into the world of film, for instance, like there could be a real market for that because there already is such a market for films that are fantastical and strange and surreal. Um, I think of yeah, I mean, I think of someone like Robert Eggers, right, who's had enormous success over the last few years with movies like Nosferatu and The Northman and The Witch, um, and and the Lighthouse, and in like all of these films, the dialogue is like consciously sort of like old timey and like kind of like semi poetic. Like
Mm.
I think that sometimes it doesn't quite work, but he's deliberately writing scripts that are not like slice of life conversation style scripts.
Right.
These are scripts where people are sort of emoting these kind of grand statements. And I'm like, well, if he's getting away with that, and if people really love it, then why couldn't we have verse dramas filmed? Like that would be amazing.
Right.
Like, and of course, there's every now and then there's a Shakespeare drama that is filmed, but Shakespeare is sort of his own beast because everyone's always going to accept and love Shakespeare. But if we could get new verse dramas that have like good production produced, I think there would be a market for that because people like epic, strange stuff, you know?
Absolutely. No, yeah,
Yeah.
there is a market for that. I mean, and I think you mentioned it, and I've mentioned it as well. If we look at things like Dune, right, so the kind of
Hmm.
fantasy, or even Lord of the Rings, right, these are all epic stories. People love that stuff. So
Yeah.
again,
And those people don't talk like regular people do either. I mean, the people in Dune and Lord of the Rings.
yeah, no,
Yeah. Hmm.
right. Not the fans. No, no,
Yeah.
no shade at the fans.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're not. Yeah, there's the Hobbit dialect. I mean, I'm not versed in the Hobbit dialect, but I know it's a thing. So yeah, no, there's so much opportunity. So then it seems like the issue is, and that's why it's nice that you guys have again your own outlets. And I think the next step is really where people more and more come together and kind of collaborate on the kind of ambitious projects that can't be realized if everybody just has their own mini fiefdom, right? If fiefdoms come together and it's like, hey, we're going to make something called Germany or Italy, right? Then you have a bit more, the fiefdom takes on a new dimension, and the talents or vitality of Thuringia is going to be paired with the other one, with Saxony or whatnot, and then you get this synthesis and you get all sorts of interesting singularities. So yeah, it seems like that, aside from people actually having to improve the quality of the work, right? Which seems like there is more of that. Even there, right? I feel like I'm reading new stuff all the time that is very promising or is very good by very promising young writers. And so yeah, it's important people know they exist and creating new ways of getting that out. That's why we're going to be focusing a lot more on the audiovisual and films and stuff once we're done with the current program. I think that will give people a chance to experience poetry in these new dimensions and sort of solidify it as the thing that can really be built up, right? Poetry is, there's a big future there.
But
Yeah.
there's one thing that you guys were talking about, though, too, in terms of that there's so much content that's out there. One of the things that I've been meaning to write about is the scalability, and that, if Dunbar's number exists, there's only so many people that you can know, and that the people who are within your your sphere of influence, who you talk to on a regular basis, that you trust and have relationships with, is actually quite small. And one of the problems with the internet is that you can meet anybody.
Mhm.
And it's so hard to figure out now, can you then collaborate with them and and work with them, and that also in terms of taste making as well, that I've found that when you find someone that you can trust, you can ask them, well, what do you watch? What do you read? And then because you know them so well, you can trust that they've kind of curated their own canon that you can borrow from, that you might like, you know, 8 out of 10 of the books that they love. And that personal relationship with art, I think, is really important. One of the very first essays that I wrote that I should probably republish is that mixtapes will save poetry.
Hmm.
In that, if you make a mixtape of like recording your favorite poetry, not just your favorite poet, but to a specific person, I think you will love Richard Cory. I think you will love A.E. Stallings' Empathy. And you have it mixed in a certain way, in a progression that has an arc, and then a B-side, you know, that there's this type of physicality to that type of deliverable. It makes it so much more special, because it's a physical thing, and we are physical people. We are ones who experience the world through our senses. Now, could it be like a magnetic tape? Sure, maybe it could be a burned CD, whatever. But the idea is that poetry for me became real when it became personal, when someone gave me Olives, A.E. Stallings collection, my friend Melanie Bettinelli. And when she gave me that, that basically transformed my relationship with wanting to write poetry, because I realized that there was a poet there that was creating something that was in form, that was musical, but it was about motherhood, or it was about, Greek women and myth. And that maybe that wouldn't speak to Elijah or to you, David, but it speaks to me, and I know other people where that would speak to them as well. That that when you have Substack, when you had, well, actually, let's take it to before Substack, when blogs are, it was harder to have that personal relationship with people. And like, if you were part of traditional publishing, good luck trying to get a fan letter from anybody, because people might love your stuff that you would never know.
Right.
But one of the things that Substack has allowed is for immediate conversation and a back and forth. And I get to recommend more poetry. If you liked this post about, you know,
Right.
Tim Steele's Orb Weaver's poem, then you are going to love this poem as well, and you get them onto things, and then things start to catch, and that's how you create this more individual culture, because it's like it's born out of love. It's for love of this person, because what you're doing is you're communicating to them through your choice and also through your own sense of taste, which you cannot develop unless you yourself are widely read. And you have kind of culled, well, I don't like this poem, but I like this. And this speaks to me because it's about a typewriter. And but yeah, there are poems I'd love to send to both of you guys that would be very different, but I think would speak to your sensibilities, but that are also things that I love. And through that, I think that then you can really have these great conversations. And as you get to know form and style and craft, you can get more into nitty gritty, like explications, like why this word instead of that word? Is this a first foot trochaic substitution? Why couldn't it have been, more regular? All these different like nitty gritty things, but it starts with, I just simply love this. And that when you're encountering other people, that you you just have this kind of like bag of holding, and you just
Mm.
give people all this stuff whenever they need it, because I've seen people climb into poems like they were lifeboats,
Mm.
like when people are grieving or
Mm.
just in in a certain state. And a lot of times I don't know what to say, but I've given them a poem off the top of my head because I needed to tell them something. And it happens to be the right poem at the right time. And it can be cathartic, but I remember it because it's well crafted. It's easy to remember. Poetry, in its essence, is a mnemonic. It is a sound all at once, meaning one big thing. If you have it like really a part of you, like there are some poems I could recite like so fast that it's like reciting Our Father, Hail Mary for a Catholic. It just kind of like comes out. You don't even have to think about it. But that's the level of experience of poetry that I think is that would be helpful to culture.
Mm.
Yeah, if you want
Yeah.
to write something worth remembering, write it in the most memorable way possible.
Yeah. And I think there's too much ego also with this like confessional poetry. One of the things that I've kind of internalized just for myself, and I haven't really said this to anybody, but like I want to write a poem where I could say that the byline is anonymous, that the poem itself is what means something. That there are poems by anonymous like all throughout history that I still remember and have
Our most
had like an
prolific
impact.
poet.
Yeah, most prolific poet. And gosh, Demon Lover, I think, is one that just like got to my heart. Like as a 12-year-old, I'm like, oh my gosh, her like boyfriend was literally Satan. It's, and like all this emotion that you want it to stand the test of time, not because you wrote it, but because it's dramatic, it's sublime. It means something in that it says something about that time in history of a lesson that you want people to learn about keeping their marriages together and to, you know, that it's but it's also just so much fun to recite like just long tracks of poetry. It's
Right.
just uh, poetry, I think, also has to be pleasurable. I mean, that's the same thing with great art. You want art to be memorable. You want to be able to revisit it. Repetition is one of the most important things for memory. And so having that desire to revisit something over and over again, see a beautiful painting, go see a Rodin sculpture and or architecture, just going to my church and looking at the ceiling is just a thing of beauty, that it calls you outside of your soul, like outside of yourself, and wants to unite with something greater. And I think that's something that is also another important aspect to good poetry, but just good art. And
Yeah,
art
and
is really important. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that I think beauty itself is content. Like if you write something that, make takes pains to be beautiful, that says something about you and it says something about the poem that you've written.
Mm.
Beauty is inherently, I think, both religious and humanistic. It is showing you that there is something beautiful outside yourself which you can adore and appreciate. And it's also showing you that, someone made this, someone made something that is like really powerful and that can affect you the way that a beautiful sunset or flower affects you. Human beings are capable of doing this. And the promotion of beauty goes side by side, I think, with the promotion of the spirit and the promotion of high ideals and the promotion of reason. Like all of these things go together. And sometimes, people distort one or the other or focus overtly on one or the other to the detriment of others. But ideally, they all go together. And it's partly why I say, like, I look for poems that have not just more of this or more of this and less of this or less of that, but that have the whole package, that have,
Mm.
that strive for beauty and, use that allurement of beauty, that charm of beauty to say something that really, is memorable and worth hearing.
I love Frost's maxim: a poem begins in delight and ends in wisdom, right? It invites you in, and from there, it takes you different places. And if it's done well, you won't forget it. You can carry that for the rest of your life. And it may serve you or save you in all sorts of ways that, fight folks wouldn't even imagine, right? And so here, a question for you guys, because I feel like we could go either way. This discussion could keep going. There's so much to cover, right? We could end with people get to read a poem, and this is just it'll just be an occasion to regroup, perhaps in different ways, or there's going to be all sorts of opportunities. What would you guys like to do? Do people have hard deadlines as well, or cutoffs?
I don't have
Uh,
anything hard that I need to get to. I kind of blocked off this
Okay.
afternoon. What are
yeah,
you,
same
Elijah?
here. Yeah,
Yeah.
it just depends on how much you want to edit, David.
Well, it's great we get to hang out, Elijah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, and
didn't
we're
mention that, like, when I said Richard Wilbur, that I got that uh, book of essays, his critical essays, at the store that you brought me to, the bookstore.
oh,
Yeah.
was it, Loganberry
Yeah, I think so.
in
Um,
Cleveland?
oh no, no, no. It's the used bookstore in Evanston.
Oh, yes. Amaranth. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so I got two books there right before going on to the plane, but it turned out to be really helpful because I used it for used a couple of things there for papers for Ryan Wilson, so
Oh,
that
good.
it worked really well. Well, I mean, I love Richard Wilbur, so that was good. Um, but yeah, and I didn't mention that the Reagan speech too. Those last lines were actually it borrows phrasing from a fairly famous sonnet that I think a lot of people don't know about now, but by someone named Gillespie. And it's about flight. And so whenever you Google poems about flying or flight or airplanes, that one comes up. But the surly bonds of earth touch the face of God, that those words come directly from that sonnet. But that you really had this fluidity between poetry and art and illusion. People don't get illusions, which is why Jeffrey Hill is so difficult. So you have to be incredibly well read to get him. And I'm also co-leading a Catherine project
Oh,
course, a
cool.
very short one. Yeah, on Tenebrae.
Nice.
So yeah, so my the co-leader actually was the one who led us with broken hierarchies throughout all last summer, which was like too much. It was a lot. And so this time, because his schedule is so tight and mine is as well, that we're just going to do one book of Jeffrey Hill, which is plenty. It's going to be over the course of just, 4 weeks and discuss number of the poems and all that. So we already have your podcast lined up for people to listen to as well to help us along. So that was really good.
Oh, it's very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah. No, this is good. And I still haven't read The Gleaning. I mentioned it already, and so I kind of feel like I should read it since I mentioned it earlier. The
Yeah,
Jared
go
Carter.
for it. I mean, not now, but when
Yeah,
David
yeah,
comes
yeah.
back. Yeah.
Yeah, to just like talk about narrative again too, and the whole new narrative movement. But in looking at Mark Jarman's poetry, I mean, he doesn't do just narrative, and so I was looking at my best American, you know, poetry books and saw his name, all throughout, and like just looking at the Holy Sonnets and looking at basically a prose poem and going, wow, you know. all forms, as long as that they're done well, are I mean, I think that quality means so much more than type or genre. It would be nice to see more epic, but it's also harder to fit in. My girls right now are listening to a musical, a concept musical called Epic, which is based on the Odyssey. And so they're pronouncing all the names correctly, like Telemachus, Polites, and all that. It's like so exciting. Um, and and knowing the stories. And in doing so, then I started kind of feeding them the books, starting with the graphic novels, and then I have, of course, like 5 translations of each behind me that I've been waiting on, and background research books as well. So, but yeah, it's kind of fun having one's kids and then testing out like, well, how would you create kind of another generation of potential poetry lovers, if not poets themselves?
Yeah, well, and I would love to do something like what you're doing when I have kids. It's definitely my intention to, when I read them stories at bedtime or whatever it is, that whatever entertainment I give them be entertainment that can be enriching and useful for them later on. So like have them learn the Bible stories, have them learn Homer and Virgil, in whatever forms they can access those things. So that yeah, that these things are not intimidating later on when they encounter them, but that they're old familiar friends and that
Yeah.
they know exactly how to swim in those waters.
Yeah. When you have that familiarity, it really does give them like a heads up on yeah, on diving into in a more academic setting. But it's also you want to make sure that like their friends and everybody else also have that experience because it's like I hate seeing a kid like so far ahead of everybody else that it's just like, well, this is for them. It's not for me. I always try to find a way to kind of get the kids who may still like a certain book or a certain poem to get them into at least exposed and to feel like it's as much for them as it is for like the A student, you know? Um, that whole idea of accessibility and that it just
Well,
being a conversation. Yeah.
all right, well, yeah, I mean, Homer was not written for the elites.
Hmm.
It's for everybody. So we should bring it to everybody in the ways that we can.
Yeah. I think that one of the biggest detriments to poetry culture is the fact that, by and large, our young people are exposed to poetry just in the academic setting, which is, to a certain extent, very competitive, or it can be, and that you want it to be more as a public exposure, you know, like in the park or, just
Hmm.
kind of
Yeah.
reciting, somehow. If only you could kind of combine karaoke and like dramatic
Have
recitations
you
of
guys seen
Homer.
there are these things called Fever, it's Fever Productions. It's basically concerts by candlelight, and they're doing them in churches. They've done them a lot here, but I know it is somewhat international. They're in London and elsewhere. So like they'll take a church, they're gonna put candles everywhere. It's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And they have musical performances, but I've also seen, sometimes it'll be local artists. It'll be just more of a recital, even just, guitar, voice and guitar, whatnot, voice and piano. And so my vision is to have basically like a poetry recital type thing, but as well interspersed ideally with musical performances. And people don't just read the poems, also you pick the right kind of poems for the setting. If it's a church setting and you have a nice intimate, there's a certain kind of poetry that lends itself to that. But that kind of performative process. And as well, people do want to unplug, right? They're looking for reasons to unplug. So I think definitely having these kind of social events, poetry recitals, not even poetry karaoke, or poetry karaoke, or in my mind, there would also be, there's like an open mic, right? So you have your performers, like you guys are all, you're comfortable, you're used to reciting poetry, you have your repertoire, but then you can also have an open mic spot for people who maybe want to read their stuff. People can decide how they want to do that. But a kind of candlelight poetry abend, if you will, poetry evening organized in nice spaces, and especially if that can be captured on film so that it's also just like a concert that people watch, but it's also people want to go in person. And if it starts to be kind of a traveling thing or a festival, I mean, the possibilities are endless. My mind just runs with all these things, but I think it's all in the cards. I think people are hungry for this stuff. And so, I mean, I love your ideas, poetry mixtapes, even. There's so many ways to now get in there. It just requires utilizing the tools of the 21st century, right? For the kind of timeless poetry that we all love, that is sort of, it lends itself to all this stuff, right? It's just, if anything, it's funny that there hasn't been more of it. So we're definitely in the right place for that. So I think after this, the hamster wheels are running. I'll have all sorts of ideas, but even just getting you guys to record some stuff. And I think once there are also some good proofs of principle, it's easier to recruit people to hey, so here's what we want to do now. So this is what we want you to help us with, where they already have some musicians. Part of it will be poetry. I'll have like a repertoire. I memorize a lot of poems, and ideally recruit some other people, maybe give a bit of coaching so that, you have a strong lineup. And if musicians perform things in between, like these well-trained classical singers, once that's captured on film and there's a good proof of principle, we can even start to go to other churches. We have like the Basilica of Montreal, which Pavarotti did his Christmas special there. It's one of the nicest churches there is in North America. If you start to reproduce that, then it becomes a big thing, and I think depending on who's performing, the poets and whatnot, you have a literature table, so people can have their books sold. There's all sorts of different ways that classic challenge, right, is how does it become profitable, or how does it become, but it totally can be. People are paying like $20,000 for a Taylor Swift ticket concert. No, not that much, right? But there's definitely a prestige, right, for that. So, and if we could recruit a virtuous aristocrat along the way who's like, you know what, I like that family that built Cayala. I don't know if in Guatemala, they recently built like a Renaissance city. It's called Cayala, funded by a Guatemalan family who no one knows their name, but the architects organized them, and they built this classical Renaissance, they call it a Christian Renaissance city. And it's beautiful. And it also uses motifs from the region as well, in terms of the capitals, and it has a bit of Aztec and whatnot, the flavors of the region. But
it'll be Maya.
Mayan, yeah, exactly. Sorry. Yeah, and that's good you said that, because Aztec is like, no babies heads down pyramids, please. We don't want that. It's not Christian. So
well, it's funny because I'm writing an essay on Aztecs right now, which is what I'll probably get back to once we end this.
What you're describing is a salon too, basically, and it's interesting that what you're describing is mostly in churches, because I think Ecstasis has been doing something like this, Inkwell events, where they have music, you have poetry, and a lot of times visual art around, and there's wine, there's cheese, and there's conviviality. It's in creating that small, intimate space. Again, this is a the idea of this is not a big concert hall, rather this is a place where you can actually meet everybody that's in this room
Mhm.
as well. And there's a certain joy to that because I think that that personal relationship thing is something that we still need to work on,
Mm.
post-pandemic and just because
Yeah.
we're all so virtual, which is why when I traveled to Notre Dame for a conference, I made sure that I actually got to see Elijah in Chicago before I left, because knowing someone virtually never really seems real enough, even though you listen to his
Mm.
podcast like whenever they're out, that it's not the same as real time, talking to somebody, sharing a meal together or
Yeah.
whatever. And there's so much more spontaneity that happens when you are in person. And it's great to have things that come as close as possible to that, like on Substack or, other venues and everything that you're doing with your podcast and these fireside chats too, that it isn't quite a fireside chat, because that would be cool. And we'd probably have like different things to say as well that add to the experience. So
We'd be talking more about wine.
there would be wine. There, there would be like different types of wine. We would like, and there would be things to eat. There would be like a breaking of bread, that idea of communion. And of
Right.
course, communion, community, communication, they all come from the same Latinate, and that is what we have in common with each other, what we share and what keeps us together. And it would be nice for it to also not just be in religious spaces, because I think that has been a driver, because I think that a lot of the Christian journals, maybe it's because of my own faith and persuasion, that I know of more Christian and Catholic events where people come together, but I'm very ecumenical. I would love for things to be more in a beautiful, home of somebody, of a patron who'd be willing to open things up and host a bunch of people and have an event.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think churches they remain a good idea because they are some of the most beautiful spaces that we have. And you do, as we've been saying over and over again, you need that initial draw, that the initial appeal of beauty often to draw people in. And of course, that's why you have the candlelight as well, because it's creating an atmosphere that people want to participate in. And then you can kind of almost seduce them uh, into absorbing and observing something that they wouldn't otherwise. And I think that, a lot of secular people recognize the value and beauty of churches. So I think that's a great idea. And of course, we should also be seeking other venues as well. But I don't think churches necessarily have to be tied to a Christian organization, or that there needs to be some sort of Christian undertone when we have a, a church as a venue for a particular event. I will say, Zeno, one of the things that uh, you've been harping on over and over again, which I really like, is the idea of make your friends your or what was I going to say? Make your make your friends your algorithms for recommendations, right? So
Mm.
something like that. And I think you could bring that into these sort of events as well. One thing that I really like that my friend Matthew Buckley Smith often says is that, when you're giving a reading, it's good to read other people's poems as well, not just to read your own poems. And I think that's great because so often poetry readings, even if the poets are good, it can seem a little bit self-indulgent. It's like, oh, everyone come and listen to me read my work. you know?
Mm.
And so, a lot of times people are doing it as a kind of favor because they're just friends with the person. They don't necessarily even like the poetry, or maybe they don't vibe with it. Maybe the poet themselves is not very good. So, it can be like a kind of dreary environment a lot of times. And like, again, even if the poet's good, there's still a sense of, oh, this is all about me. And that can be slightly uncomfortable. And I think that you can incorporate what Zina is saying into these sorts of things by reading other people's poems. Like if you're going to have an event that melds music and poetry, and you're a poet who knows a lot about poetry and has a lot of great recommendations for people, read some of your own poems, but also read poems by people who you really like, and that will actually draw more people in, right? Because I think more people are, if you're a stranger and I say, oh, so and so is performing their poetry, I'm like, well, I don't even know so and so. Why would I go?
Yeah.
But it's like so and so is not just performing their poetry, but they have this like curated list of poems that they're performing. Then it's like, oh, well, if I'm someone who's interested in poetry and wants to get to know poetry better, this might be something I would enjoy. So, we can incorporate these recommendations, these sort of personal friend-like algorithms into these performances. And I think that would increase their mass appeal as well. And I think that we should strive to marry and cross-pollinate poetry with as many other venues and genres as possible. Use the fact that other genres are more popular than poetry so that poetry can piggyback off of those other genres' popularity. If
Mhm.
there's going to be like I've been thinking like, once I get a book published, I want to be able to open for metal shows, with my poems. Because like, why not? That would be awesome. Or like if you're having a visual arts exhibition, you could talk to the people who are organizing it and say, oh, wouldn't it be great if there was some ekphrastic poetry to go along with all of these different artworks? There's a place in Cleveland that does that I participated in before. And just things like that. Or yeah, making verse dramas into little films. I think there's so many ways that you can combine the art forms in ways that will break through the incestuous cesspool of just the literary community who likes poetry to reach a broader audience.
Absolutely. And in very surprising ways, right? That'll catch people off guard. Like, how is this possible? But yeah, the repertoire, I mean, it's done all the time. You go to see, you have Bach, you have the classics that everybody recognizes and they go. And unfortunately, it's done in like with a lot of the more modernist or contemporary experiments. They kind of game the system where it's like, yeah, you're gonna hear Bach and Beethoven, and then you get some really wild stuff and it's like, well, hang on, and like the Beethoven's right at the end and they've made some,
Right, you're gonna have to sit through this before you get any Beethoven.
yeah. So but to actually do that the right and honest way where it's like, okay, no, you're gonna have, there's a repertoire of the classics, people want to hear the Raven. If it's done well, I think it can be, it is elevating and sublime. It's done in a cartoonish, you know pricey and we're creepy, I'm tales, it's Tales from the Crypt or something. It's like, well, I don't think that's really what Poe is going for. But so you have the classics and then you just have good, serious living poets also presenting their stuff. And that's a beautiful mix. You can create, it can become a really timeless moment, right? With living voices and departed voices, and that's where you get that simultaneity of eternity. And people will feel that, right? It'll be the experience is what will confirm that it's real, right? That beauty is timeless, beauty is truth, truth beauty. They'll feel it. So yeah,
Yeah,
I'm excited about that. And so just to Zina, you had the gleaning, so that we
Oh, yeah.
introduce the
So,
poems for our listeners here. Jared Carter is he's
yep.
excellent.
And I'm reading it out of the Reaper essays because one of the things that we had been talking about before and coming on to onto your show is that with Elijah and his manifestos, one of the things that I remember as being a manifesto is in this the Reaper essays called "The Reaper's Non-Negotiable Demands," and I mean, I'll just name them. Take prosody off the hit list. Stop calling formless writing poetry. Accuracy at all costs. No emotion without narrative. No more meditating on the meditation. No more poems about poetry. No more irresponsibility of expression. Raise the house of fashion. Dismantle the office of translation and spring open the jail of the self. And so some of these would have to be explained further, but I mean, it's kind of like the planting, the flag
Right.
here and then now defending it. But one of the things that the Reaper essays or the Reaper as a publication from I think 1908 to 1989, I mean, it's just for a finite amount of time. What they're known for is the new narrative movement. And so there's an essay here called How to Write Narrative Poetry, a Reaper Checklist. And I should also mention that the Reaper is a persona created by Mark Jarman and Robert McDowell, two poets known for being part of the New Formalist movement, but strongly advocated for a renewal of narrative poetry. And by creating a persona, it allowed them to speak in this one really confrontational voice. And so there are fun things that you can do when you create a persona
Mm.
and it be more edgy, more metal.
Right.
And so in this one particular essay about the narrative poetry, that this poem is so devastating. And it reminds me of Robert Frost's Out Out with the little boy. And this is, I'll just go ahead and read it and let it speak for itself. So here's The Gleaning by Jared Carter. All day long they have been threshing, and something breaks. The canvas belt that drives the separator flies off. Parts explode through the swirl of smoke and chaff, and he is dead where he stands. Drops the pitchfork as they turn to look at him, and falls. They carry him to the house and go on with the work. 5 wagons and their team stand waiting. It is still daylight. There will be time enough for grieving. When the undertaker comes from town, he brings the barber, who must wait till the women finish washing the body. Neighbors arrive from the next farm to take the children. The machines shut down, one by one. Horses are led away. The air grows still and empty, then begins to fill up with the sounds of cicada and mourning dove. The men stand along the porch, talking in low voices, smoking their cigarettes. The undertaker sits in the kitchen with the family. In the parlor, the barber throws back the curtains and talks to this man whom he has known all his life, since they were boys together. As he works up a lather and brushes it onto his cheeks, he tells him the latest joke. He strops the razor, tests it against his thumb, and scolds him for not being more careful. Then, with darkness coming over the room, he lights a lamp and begins to scrape at the curve of the throat, tilting the head this way and that, stretching the skin, flinging the soap into a basin, gradually leaving the face glistening and smooth. And as though his friend has fallen asleep, and it were now time for him to stand up and stretch his arms and look at his face in the mirror and feel the closeness of the shave and marvel at his dreaming. The barber trims the lamp and leans down and says, for the last time, his name.
Mm. Beautiful, beautiful. So good.
What's
Did you
really
know?
great about, oh, go ahead,
I
Elijah.
was going to say, did you know that Jared is one of Steve's favorite poets?
No,
Oh
wait.
yeah,
I mean, I know that he mentioned, but I didn't know that he was one of his favorite ones. But he's one of mine as well. I found out about him through reading Dana Gioia when I was spite
gotcha.
reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So Jared Carter was one, and Ted Kooser, Kay Ryan. I remember all 3 of them. I read those poets because Dana said to read them, and and I fell in love with Jared Carter's poetry, actually. Still not quite the same type of love as Stallings, but so compelling. And this poem is one of them, that because it is so concise. And what I was talking about when you read a story and the frustration of when there's so much filler, so much is done in so few lines, and the lines themselves are just they just look so short. Parts explode through the swirl. I mean, it's trimeter there. I mean, but you see the rhythm, and there's such a cadence, and the punctuation is so nicely done there where you take a breath. And the thing about reading a book, you see like poetic instances in Austen or in Cormac McCarthy and all that. And sometimes when you read it aloud, it sounds really good. But when you have a narrative poetry, it's really tight. It always sounds good when you have like this blank verse. Um, and it's so much more dramatic, I think.
Well, it's why I think verse drama is the best genre of literature because it's narrative and you can even have, very strongly lyric moments in it, but also you completely get rid of all the descriptive fluff, right? Like
Hmm.
it's just characters talking. And so you have sort of an inherent tightness there. And then if it's in verse, you're going to have the condensation that comes with it being in verse as well. And so a really good verse drama, I think nothing tops it. Because and you can even have epic elements in there, like when in a messenger speech, there's always epic elements in there. There's lyric elements in a chorus or in a figure who's fulfilling a choral function. And then, of course, that's all just on the page. And then you have the whole other dimension of the fact that verse drama can actually be performed, which
Hmm.
is, it's a totally different capability. And then you can marry it with music and with the visual arts, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I'm totally on board.
Yeah. Have you heard of Jane Charles?
Yes.
Yeah, because she's done drama as
Oh yes,
well.
that's why I've heard her name because um,
Yeah, Sunny
she's
Leia
she's been with
Martinez.
Wise
Yeah,
Blood. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah. So she's really great. And David, probably someone that you would could have fun talking to. I mean, about if you wanted to have people who write in different
Yeah, no, that
genres that are not lyric, you know?
yeah, and we want people to hear and experience the poetry firsthand. And you're doing a great job, by the way, just the performance as well. Did you not did I read somewhere that did you do some acting or something in
N- No, I there was a longer story, but the short answer is no.
no drama,
See, Zina
no
and I
high,
both
no
Zina and I were talking earlier about how we'd both had done opera in the past, or we both gone to school for opera in the past.
Yeah, so we're both
I took
trained
private
as opera. Yeah.
I took private bel canto lessons that my Italian grandma paid for. So
Oh, great.
she wanted till I started learning the German. And World War II, left Italy. She didn't like me learning those lieder, but I was grandma. I'm like a light tenor. Like that's just
Yeah.
you gotta know your repertoire. And Mozart's great. Don't hate. But no, all that to say that. So okay, so everybody studied. That's interesting. All three of us have studied opera.
Music.
Yeah.
Yeah, opera music. Yeah. And I think, and so did Dana Gioia, like he was very much into that as well. Weep, Shudder, and Die. That's his latest opera book, which I haven't read because I used up all my money on books right now. So have to build up the reserves and try to get the latest books
Yeah,
there by him.
Yeah, I have it like somewhere right there. But yeah, it's great. And what were you've talked about A. Stallings. And yeah,
Oh
that's what's great.
gosh,
You
yes.
guys have name dropped some folks that we'll have to bring on. Jared Carter, we're coming for you. You're gonna have to come on the show sometime. Um, but yeah, maybe read us some Stallings because I as well. Whenever I ran into her stuff, I was like, wow, what a singular voice, and there. You can tell it's a poet who is somebody living in our times, and yet there's just this timeless aura to the verses, and it's refreshing, right? It's very refreshing.
Yeah.
Have
We
any?
were talking about empathy earlier, and that's the name of my favorite poem. I mean, I love so many of her poems. Fear of Happiness, which is the beginning of her collected works, This Afterlife. I love that poem. Cast Irony is like great. So much of her poetry is like domestic disputes, like a jar is a disagreement with her husband. And this one, empathy, is as well, but the framing is so interesting because it's framed in the negative, and it begins with my love, and so it's an address to him. And the one of the things that, like, when I see some beginning poets and they're trying to write, sometimes they don't know who they're writing to. It's like, I'm writing to the world. It's like, no, how about you concentrate on one person? Then you
Mm.
get this refined voice because you're speaking to someone that you can picture, right? And so some of the most compelling poems that I think I've been able to write have been because I am addressing one particular person, or I am taking on a persona of a certain voice to a certain person. But empathy is really interesting because it also addresses something that's really hard to do, which is a social issue, which is the Syrian refugees washing up on shore in Greece. And instead of like being a message heavy poem that runs the risk of sounding like sloganeering, listen to me, this
Banging
is me,
people on the head.
this poem does it so masterfully with such wonderful form and this envelope rhyme. It's amazing. It has a certain cadence to it. So I'm just go ahead and let the poem speak for itself again. So
Okay.
here's Empathy by A.E. Stallings. My love, I'm grateful tonight that our listing bed isn't a raft, precariously adrift as we dodge the Coast Guard light and clasp hold of a girl and a boy. I'm glad we didn't wake our kids in the thin hours to take not a thing, not a favorite toy. And we didn't hand over our cash to one of the smuggling rackets, that we didn't buy cheap life jackets, no better than bright orange trash and less buoyant. I'm glad that the dark above us is not deeply twinned beneath us and moiled with wind, and we don't scan the sky for a mark, any mark that demarcates us shore as the dinghy starts taking on water. I'm glad that our 6-year-old daughter who can't swim is a foot off the floor in the bottom bunk, and our son with his broken arms high and dry, that the ceiling is not seeping sky, with their journey but hardly begun. Empathy isn't generous, it's selfish. It's not being nice to say I'd pay any price, not to be those who would die to be us.
Read the last. Read the
The
conclusion.
last, yeah. Empathy isn't generous, it's selfish. It's not being nice to say I would pay any price, not to be those who would die to be us.
Mm, very good.
Yeah.
When did she? Which year was this written in?
Oh gosh. Well, this was in Like, which came out in 2018.
Okay,
So,
fascinating.
yeah. That's where I remember reading it first. And yeah, and she had a number of other poems that kind of addressed the plight of refugees because she had been working with them.
Hmm.
And by far this I think this is the most successful of all of them because you do I think she did erasure poetry. Yeah, she did an erasure poem, which was okay, and it's different. She works in different forms, but this has that economy, that tightness to it. The the shorter lines, the rhymes, and that because of the enjambment, it just flows, you know. But it's like each stanza is like a lifeboat in and of itself. It's kind of enclosed and you need that form in order to keep the emotion from spilling out. It gives you a discipline. And yet, what she also does is she creates this visuals, bright orange trash, this and the image of the kids, but they're not her kids, but she's imagining another family that could be her family if she had had different luck, you know? And that's what makes the difference sometimes between, tragedy and being able to live your life.
And it's a beautiful, I don't want to say it's sublime, I guess you could say. It's a beautiful inversion at the end, right? In terms of poetically how we think about empathy, but it communicates a higher and noble idea using material that seems quite dark, and we all think, oh, empathy, just give somebody a pass for whatever the thing is. Here, there's a development of the theme of empathy in a way that I think is profound, and that's what poetry does, right? It takes common things. Everyone's heard the word empathy. Everyone's been told to be empathetic, and here she is, kind of, okay, be empathetic, right? But she kind of turns it on its head, but in a brilliant way. So yeah, I think this idea of inversion is also useful when we're thinking about composition, creating ironies in the good sense, right? Not like Starbucks, I'm ironic, but kind of actually flipping things on their head in order to invite thought and reflection. I have one, I don't know if I liked her datal. I like to see modern poets treat classic or timeless themes and see how they do it. Because I think this idea of treatment's very useful. Like the Greeks, they were innovators as well. I feel like the contemporary aesthetic mind thinks that innovation means it's like year zero. You have to start from scratch. You have to do something that completely different that nobody has ever imagined or whatnot. But yet the Greeks, often innovation came by taking a story that was well known and just giving it a subtly different treatment, where with even just a few small changes, you get a completely different cosmos, if you will, in terms of the moral universe, the epistemology, the philosophical paradoxes. And so you don't need a lot, in a sense, to do something new, right? If you're creative and you know how to treat a theme musically, in the same way Bach could take 3 notes and subject it to all sorts of transformations and really develop a melody in a thorough fashion. That's where you see the genius, right? You don't have to create this go in all sorts of different places if you can just treat a theme properly. So like Daedalus, I'll just read this one because I really liked it. I love the myth of Daedalus, right? Mythic architect builds the wings for his son, to escape from the labyrinth that he created, only to, give his son the wings that will, lead to his death. And so genius, you can be very clever, right? Daedalus was very clever, but cleverness isn't necessarily the same thing as wisdom, right? And so here, Daedalus, to build a labyrinth, it takes a twisted mind, a puzzled art, a fractal branching of mistakes. Drag out the shovels and the rakes, the spirit level, sacred chart. To build a labyrinth, it takes shadows, stones, a way that snakes and ladders to its shaky start. An average mazing of mistakes, the kind that everybody makes, set random intervals apart. To build a labyrinth, it takes dead ends that seem like lucky breaks, the paths of bats that weave and dart through limestone caverns of mistakes. The shaken etch-a-sketch awakes a lost child buried in its heart. To build a labyrinth, it takes some good intentions, some mistakes. I like there's one can ponder that for a while, right? And it takes the story as it is, but revisits it in a way that is very edifying, right? So I like that.
I,
This will be
you
this.
know, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say this will be the second time I recommend this on air, but if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend you read Michael Ayrton's The Maze Maker, which is Michael Ayrton is a was a British sculptor, and so he is able to approach the story is from the perspective of Daedalus, and because the author is a craftsman, he's able to approach the story of Daedalus with some real craft know-how,
Hmm.
and that gives it like a really interesting gives him a really interesting approach. And also because he's not a novelist by trade, he's a sculptor. The novel itself is a bit weird. Like it's not a novel that you would expect a novelist who had gone, who had gotten his MFA in novel writing to write. It gets kind of surreal, like in the second half, and the description of the death of Icarus is just astonishing. Like it's this whole metaphysical singularity that Daedalus attempts to describe using his own language of science, which is really interesting. So I highly recommend that book, The Maze Maker, if Daedalus is a favorite of yours.
Very cool. Duly noted. Yeah, I mean, the theme is favorite of mine. All the more to see a poet like A. Stallings is like, oh wow, this is awesome. She's treating these themes and she does it so well.
Well, I mean, I think that speaks to what you were talking about, I think the last show about tradition, and knowing the tradition and having a sense of the canon. And that's as people become less literate and wanting to kind of cut away reading, Homer or Shakespeare. I mean, when I went to college, here's the shocking thing: I didn't have to read any Shakespeare to get my literature degree,
Mm.
which I think is weird. I
Yeah.
mean, I was going, really? Like I could learn, and I didn't actually. You could, there were classes on Shakespeare, but it was not a requirement. You could go through 4 years of getting a bachelor's degree where I went to school and not have to read a lick of Shakespeare.
Hmm.
So, and that says something. But because I think that there are three things that you have to be knowledgeable about in order to be a literate person in an English, Western culture, and that's the Bible. I mean, regardless of whether or not you believe that there's so much story in there in the Old Testament and also in the New Testament and Homer, you have to know the Homeric epics, and you have to know and Shakespeare. I mean, you should have some type of basic working knowledge of those three things at the very least. And then, of course, there are like so many other things. You should know Dickinson and Whitman, and you should know all these other things because they're in Frost. But in terms of poetry, but that's the foundation of Western literature. But I mean, when talking about Greek myth and Daedalus, and also I was thinking of the name Aphrodite. You say Aphrodite, that evokes all this story. It evokes lust and love and eros and you know golden apples, whole wars, in that just in that word, in Aphrodite, like 4 syllables, that it becomes a shortcut to to this whole path of knowledge, so, at which you can be literate with other people who have read the same things. You don't have to explain who Aphrodite was because people will know she's the goddess of love. But we're starting to take that for granted, that people will know Romeo and Juliet or any of these other things. I mean, thank goodness that there's enough out there that makes them knowledgeable about that. But there are going to be if we don't have some type of corrective action,
Mhm.
that there is so much content out there that people won't be exposed to it. That some people may be prejudiced against learning about this because, dead white guy, and that would be devastating, I think, to have, a generation of people who were ignorant of this common language and tradition.
Absolutely. Here. That's why I'm like, not on my watch. No, I mean, there's a lot that can be done now. And I feel this is where it takes us out of the domain. The discussion takes us out of the domain of literature per se, right? But I like conspiracies. If you wanna reimagine a society, if you want to repattern a society, if you want to give it a new identity, well, you have to strip it of its roots first, right? Doesn't mean, the roots, the whole point of having roots in tradition isn't that it's all perfect or it's all this or it's all that, but that people have some sense of historical identity. And if you take that away from people, they become receptive to all sorts of things, right? They're much more malleable because they're just not rooted in anything. And so, yeah, I mean, getting rid of classical Greek and Latin, getting rid of Homer, the Bible, just from basic classical education, that's sketchy. You know what I mean? I don't care what the arguments are. It's very, very sketchy. It's very suspect. And yeah, it should be pushed back on in every manner possible because it's not acceptable if we're going to talk about education and culture and the consequences when you just try and create a blank slate, and which never really works. I mean, it always has unexpected consequences when you want to just create a blank slate. It's not a good move. So yeah, good news being that now, yeah, I think people are more enthusiastic about sort of wrestling back. The Jonathan Pajot, he talks about taking back the stories, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with Jonathan Pajot, but he's been producing a series of the fairy tales, the classic fairy tales, basically retelling the classic fairy tales. But the idea being that, people have to take back their stories because otherwise you're just having them reimagined by other folks who don't really care about the story per se, right? They care in the usefulness, right? And in ways that stories can be weaponized, even, which is dangereux. It's not good.
Yeah, and I think a way to take this out of the realm of simple conservatism, just say, oh, we should all be reading the great books of the West and the West is the best, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the way to break beyond that is to say, yes, you should read all of these things because they're great, but also we should be reading the great Persian poets. We should be reading the great Indian poets and Japanese poets and Chinese poets because there's so much richness there and they have their own entire systems of illusion, which we don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Oh
would be great
yeah,
if we did.
it would be wonderful to have a balance of what's created uh, various flourishing societies. And, just speaking as someone who didn't get to see, characters that looked like me and couldn't, I mean, I related as best I could, but when I saw a book cover of someone who looked like me when I was a little girl, I wanted to read that book. I mean, that's just something of human nature. And there is so much to love about ancient Chinese poetry and Japanese poetry. And like I'm in a situation right now where someone asked if I could help with a translation project from Old Tagalog, and it's a passion play. And it's so exciting to be able to work on something that's really meaty and that's very it's just so well done. You can tell, but it is so hard to do. But if I'm able to successfully do this, then people will have a translation of a Filipino poet, and it'll be great. And one of the other projects that I'm kind of working on is that my parents' dialect, Pangasinan, is the seventh spoken dialect in the Philippines, but it's kind of dying out and being replaced by by Tagalog, by the Filipino language, and also by English because of social media and the internet. And so I'm kind of working on trying to find poetry, trying to find works that could translate into English poetry, just to have some exposure for people who don't know this dialect, and see the beauty of it, and then that kind of be a bridge for some type of preservation as well. But that the I think the it really is helpful for me to also have a basis of other traditions and how things are done, and using you know pentameter where it just sounds better in English, and but honoring the pattern of the original language, but just being solid in those skills. I mean, knowing Shakespeare really helps with that. And yeah, and knowing narrative, knowing stories, and knowing epics, that is incredibly useful. And the fact that so many high schoolers only read portions of the Odyssey
Mm.
is such, I think it's a problem. I think you need to see something long and in context and feel like you've achieved something by the end of it.
Well, that's the other speaking of projects as well. I mean, teaching through poetry is arguably historically that's what it was, number one. So we're not saying anything controversial here. People would learn about their history through poetry, about their identity. They would also be confronted with, big philosophical ideas, huge paradoxes, their mortality, right? A lot of great poems. One of our last guests, we were talking about the idea of memento mori. Don't forget to die, right? It's what all the great philosophers were busy thinking about. And I mean, where do people confront this, especially in a visceral way? It's through art. And historically, poetry was kind of the mother of that. And from that, you got painting, you got sculpture. It was the myths were preserved through poetry. So there is so much that could be taught, right? It'd be interesting to have different kind of not experimental schools, but programs even where, you could teach a whole course on philosophy just using poems. You could teach a whole course on you could frame a course on, if you're going to talk about ancient history, I mean, a lot of it can be learned by going through the poetry, right? If you want to learn about the Renaissance and how that became possible, you should probably read the Divine Comedy, because a poet created the literate language of the Italians that served as the vehicle for elaborating and communicating all the kinds of profound ideas that emerged during the Renaissance. If you didn't have that literate language, if you just had all these shabby dialects, right? For people don't know, like Italy historically, even to this day, though, it's very tribal in like all the different neighborhoods had their own dialects. And if you just went down a couple streets, it's like, we do things different here. Here's how we do it. Here's how we say it. So Dante was like, well, it's not going to work. If we want to have an eloquent vernacular, something that can sort of mirror what the classic languages were able to achieve, we need a poetical language. And that was the basis. If you didn't have that, we wouldn't have all the other things that we talk about and celebrate when we think about the Renaissance. And we wouldn't have a lot of the things that we celebrate in terms of the modern achievements of mankind if you hadn't had a Renaissance in Europe after the Middle Ages. Things would look different. So you can learn all of that, right? If you start with the comedy, you're going to be thrust into such a vast world of learning and history and philosophy and science, the history of science, right? Which is just as important. There's so much that can be done. So it's fun that we've been talking for a while, and it's like, oh yeah, there's just like a million quadrillion possibilities, and there's so much potential. And that's what's exciting, right? If people have a sense of an intimation of the potential, and they can allow their imaginations to wander and play a little bit in ways that they were kind of, punished for in the past because it wasn't like the right way to think about art or poetry. Yeah, also this is how the Renaissance happened. People are like, okay, we can start to think about a few things slightly differently or go back to the original sources, and all of a sudden you have all sorts of enthusiasm.
Mm-hmm. I think that in terms of being educated in the great books and like in a tradition and all that, that we do have kind of a lack of education just because there was, I guess, philosophical educational differences, because I feel like I didn't get a certain education that I would have loved. And that the I'm involved in something called the Catherine Project. So if someone wanted to learn about Renaissance poetry or actually Greek language, Latin language, and all of that, there is a free resource called the Catherine Project, and you could go to catherineproject.org and look at all their different offerings, and you could be exposed to Arabic philosophers and oh, what else? I mean, they start off with the A Life of the Mind seminar, and you go through Parmenides all the way through like Aristotle and Lucretius and all the way up to Flannery O'Connor. And I just completed a course over there, and it gives you kind of this crash course overview of philosophy and early sciences and in fiction, but but also I learned about St. Augustine's Confessions, Virgil. I studied with them both the Odyssey and the Iliad, and what else? I mean, there are some resources that are out there, and I think there's Albertus Magnus as well, where they have courses where you could learn about Divine Comedy. And so I think that would be of interest to some of your listeners as well, if you're hungry for more, that you also don't have to pay for Catherine Project. It would be great to give them money because they do great work. But it's like Versecraft in terms of just this wonderful resource for those who want to know things deeply and know things better, that you can sign up for these courses. And it's just been so enriching. And I really like Elijah's podcast for the variety of poems that he's exposed me to, just as a listener as well. That that to have a place where you know you're going to be given good stuff if you go there.
Mm.
I think it's really great. So when I go to Catherine Project, I know that any one of those courses is going to be great. Listen to Elijah's podcast. I know it's going to be a good poem because he's got really good tastes. And through him, I got into Sleep Ricketts podcast, and I think Matthew's awesome. And so I think that there's a way of generating this culture through personal recommendations and true philia, you know? I mean, we're walking the same road together. I mean, and I consider myself an amateur in the essential definition as someone who just does something because they love the art, they love the poetry.
Mhm.
Right. And, we can be very doom and gloom about the academy and about how it's collapsing and how the humanities are done for, et cetera, which is kind of true. And it's horrible. And there's, we should fight as much as we can against that. But at the same time, you were talking earlier about, oh, how can we get all of these great books out of the academy? Well, we're kind of having to, like we have to in order to continue these things. I was put in a place where I recognized the need, and so I made something like Versecraft. And I'm sure for the Catherine Project, it was the same. Like people are going out of their way, to step outside the professionalism of academia to be amateurs, amateur like lover lovers, the real lovers of these things are putting together their own resources, their own projects. And so I think that, as much as our culture may be going down in flames, there are these pockets of light which are going to remain around, and more of them are going to be keep popping up because there are people who are concerned about preserving these things, and in times of crisis, that's when heroism emerges. Not that I'm not trying to inadvertently call myself a hero, but there are people who are willing, who recognize that there's something bad happening, and will be the spur to get them to do something about it. And in a way, that could be a spur to a new kind of golden age, like, taking things out of the fossilized academy and putting them into a place where, you really have to fight on the base of merit to get noticed. And, we can hopefully build communities where that merit and that love is encouraged outside of, whether you need to study for a certain test or you need to get a certain grade.
Yeah, I mean that's like the definition of like the liberal arts, the free arts, as opposed to the servile arts, like that, leisure is the basis of culture. The Joseph Piper essay. I that it's it's interesting that this is stuff that we do freely given. I mean, it's an effort that it takes, but it's so necessary for our culture to have art that is created that's kind of free from being commoditized or being part of one's work too. I mean, these are labors of love. Because the fact that the Catherine Project is free and it was born out of a need, and you see a need, you fill a need. It's an act of service, and for which the gains of which are cultural and therefore are generational. So the idea that once your lifetime ends, you've given something to another generation, and that it is in itself generative to have beauty that just lives on beyond your own work. I mean, when people built cathedrals and monuments, bringing it back to a monumental manifesto, that you, a lot of people go into this knowing that they will never see the building completed, the monument completed, but that you have a vision and that you believe it's important and that it commemorates something that 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 needs to be seen and recognized. And so it is beyond yourself. And that is ultimately an act of generosity. And so all the things that we do in this culture through arts, through our poetry and whatever, that the fruits of our labor are not for our lifetimes. And that I think that a lot of poets nowadays do things because they want their name on that byline, want to be recognized for the good work they do, because their ambitions have to do with themselves sometimes. That it's not about them being seen, but about what kind of world you create for your children, and will people be compassionate for them and take care of them after you're gone? I mean, as a mother, I think about those things all the time because I have a very neurodiverse family. And the idea, empathy, cultivating that compassion, charity, generosity, and understanding. This is how my children are going to survive. And if we don't create that, and I'm not there to protect them, then I could get very depressed very fast thinking about that. You know,
I,
this is, again, high stakes, I think.
I would also just add, even for the more self-seeking mind, what they can actually learn from what you just said as well is if you look at most of the great creative accomplishments or sort of immortal monuments, whether in poetry or architecture, it was motivated by more than there was a recognition, right? That we're all mortals and there's a sense of there's a moral drive to contribute something greater, right? To the greater whole. And people can say, oh no, well, the Medicis just wanted to sort of, you know, adorn themselves and create a legacy. But at the end of the day, the artists who they were employing had quite different identities than their patrons. Sure, if you're a patron and you got a gazillion dollars, it's probably going to look good for you if you build a beautiful, timeless city. But the people involved in actually making the discoveries and the creativity, they, this is why I like reading biographies. You can learn about Beethoven's identity. You know, you hear people say all sorts of things about Beethoven, but when you read his biography, I mean, he was a truly Promethean soul. His heroes were Joan of Arc, Jesus, Socrates, you know, and he suffered a lot. He went through all sorts of excruciating trials. I mean, Mozart was poor, constantly struggling. There was something deeper and greater animating them. And if people, you know, if they want to be creative and they want to foster a truly healthy and visionary imagination, they should start with that, right? Find that deeper thing inside you that can actually connect with mankind and be in touch with all mankind, right? Not just your neighbors, not just, you know, folks that you know, that you work with or whatnot, but, you know, have a relationship with the greatest minds. Then you're really in touch with humanity, the whole spectrum of humanity. And then creativity becomes like natural. So it's just funny. I find that, you know, there's how many of these, like, just like there's self-help today, like how are you gonna become your fully self-actualized self and like be in a flow state 24/7. There's like how to write when, you know, you have no ideas, or how to write, like how to just get started. And it's just like, well, wait, if you're tapping into the real thing and your motivations are coming from the right place, the magic usually takes care of itself, right? The magic of life happens on its own. But if you're like trying to fall in love, you know, or you're trying to be a poet, that can get you all sorts of trouble, right? It doesn't necessarily work that way. The poetry has to find you. Love has to find you. You know, these aren't things you can really chase after, at least not how we usually think about it. I find that's helpful. You know, then it's a different phase space and all sorts of unexpected things happen.
Yeah, it's funny like now when we look at the films from the 1990s, because the 90s was such a stable time. And like what are the angsts that they're wrestling with there? It's like, oh, my job is too stable. Like my days are too routine. Like there's nothing going on in the world. I'm aimless and I need to find meaning for my life. So I'm going to join a fight club or whatever it is.
Uh, uh,
Like the like those issues seem quaint now because we live in a time where there's news and history happening every day, all the time, and it's bananas. And so, while I think there's a lot of really terrible things happening now and a lot of things to be alarmed about and to try to fight back against, I do think that we can take advantage of the energy of this time to do something great. I think that, if we are being put in a corner, that's motivation for us to really lash out, to us to really fight back. Um, if the humanities are, being kicked out of the academy, we have an opportunity to make something new and better. And you know, not that I encourage the death of the academies, but like, the academies that's like where postmodernism has been preserved for the past many, many, many decades. If the academies fall, postmodernism falls, and good riddance, I say. Um, and so, we have an opportunity to create like a whole new world of literature and literary taste right now. Yeah, and we have this amazing new thing, the internet, which allows us to do that.
Here, here. I mean, we can wrap it up. Like, how do people feel, and maybe have some closing thoughts, and people can close as they like. And obviously, make your shameless plugs. We like a shameless plug. So make sure our listeners know where to find you. And we're going to link in the post that we put out. We're going to link to your guys' outlets and different projects. You can send me an email if you want specific things linked. And yeah, everyone will be able to share this video after as well. So yeah, any closing thoughts, guys? And I could go on again for hours, but yeah, fret not. I think there's a lot of potential. And if people can just allow themselves to see what's there, right? And like you said, this healthy algorithm where yeah, there are so many great things that people can be referred to right now, and very promising and exciting.
Yeah. And that's what I would like to reemphasize after all, the wonderful things we've talked about is these actionable things we can do. Whether it just be recommending good things to your friends or, checking out so and so's Substack or podcast, but also like what you're trying to do, like putting together these concert series, um, you know, getting in touch with different venues so that we can create these new communities, reaching out so that we can put poetry in contact with other media and, create those new opportunities. I think that's the real thing to take away from this. And I hope people who are listening are inspired to have their own ideas about how they can do that, how they can take poetry outside of the bubble that it's in and have it permeate all of society, because it's when a culture has poetry in the atmosphere that poetry really thrives. And if we can do that, then we'll be in good shape.
Amen.
And
My name,
Elijah, I think we didn't do any formal introductions. So you might want to like just tell people who you are and where to find you and what your projects are.
Come full circle. We finally got to the
all
formalities.
right, this is when the podcast really starts. My so Zina has been very kind enough to mention Versecraft a number of times on this episode already. But my name is Elijah Perseus Blumov. I'm a poet and a critic. You can find my poems and criticism in various places. If you follow me on Substack or on Versecraft, which is my podcast, then you'll get some updates about that kind of thing. Hopefully, I'll also be putting together like a real poet website soon. I don't have that yet, but stay tuned. In the meantime, you can reach me at versecraft.buzzsprout.com for my podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. And also at versecraft.substack.com, where you can see the essays in print that I read for Versecraft, as well as some other things. I'll probably be posting a link to this on my Substack so that people are aware of it. So you'll be able to keep up with what I'm doing if you subscribe.
And Elijah does a lot. So he's published in where you've been in Literary Matters and also in Think Journal and of course New Verse Review, which is where the Iron Lyre and the Manifesto or
Monumentalist Manifesto, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, Birmingham Poetry Review, Alabama Literary Review, Modern Age. Like I've been quite a this is not like my list of this is not my resume, but you can find my poems if you look around, especially in the formalist space, magazines that are friendly to formal poetry.
And just as a tip, there's an about page on the Substack that you can use as a temporary, or just you can use it as your about page so that you can link to all your various projects and all that on that site. Because
That's a good
I've
point.
been meaning to
Yeah.
do that. I mean, it's a central place anyway. It's like versecraft.substack.com, and then people do click on about page apparently to try to figure out who you are if you write something
Mhm.
that they like. And so I have to really fix mine up so that it looks like an actual poet website. But I've found Substack really versatile and helpful with that. But I too am on Substack. I write a Substack called The Beauty of Things, and I should say my name is Zina Gomez Liss, and I am a MFA candidate at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. And I'm also a contributing editor at New Verse Review. And what else? And so I have a Substack, The Beauty of Things, at zinagomezlist.substack.com. I live right outside of Boston with my husband and 5 children, spanning an age from elementary school all the way to post high school. So it's a fun bunch, and they supply me with a lot of topics for poetry.
That's great. Beautiful. And yeah, so we're going to link to your stuff. I think this was a very productive chat, and I liked it. It turned into all sorts of different things. We workshopped different ideas. We read some poems. We talked about poems. So yeah, this is great, guys. I mean, thank you both for joining us. Thank you,
Thank you for
everybody,
having
for
us.
listening.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and we're going to be back again soon.